Clara Vance, 35 years old, had been standing motionless before the empty crib for nearly a full minute when she realized that her 4-month-old son was no longer in the apartment. Leo's bag of clothes was gone, his passport was gone, and the insurance file Clara always kept locked inside a drawer had disappeared as well. The penthouse apartment overlooking Seattle remained terrifyingly quiet. Rain slid down the glass windows, dragging distorted trails of water across the city, sinking beneath a blanket of gray. In the nursery, a pale blue wool blanket hung crookedly over the side of the crib. The last bottle Clara had prepared the night before was still sitting on the table, completely cold. She did not scream. Clara simply placed 2 fingers against the edge of the crib, the same way she examined an antique painting before beginning a restoration. A small crack never appeared on its own. It always began with some kind of pressure, silent and repeated, until it spread deep into the canvas beneath the surface. Her marriage had been the same. 3 years earlier, Clara met Julian Vance at a charity auction in Vancouver. At the time, she was examining the yellowed varnish on a century-old portrait when Julian stood behind her and gently pointed out a hidden brushstroke near the subject's collar. It was the first time Clara had ever met someone who could see what she saw. Julian was a respected art broker, polished, charming, and gifted at making everyone he met feel important. He remembered that Clara took her coffee without sugar. He sent flowers whenever she completed a difficult project. Once, he stood outside her studio for hours on a snowy night just so he could drive her home. Everyone said Clara was lucky. They did not know that beneath those perfectly tailored suits, Julian was a man who needed to control every room he entered. He chose the restaurants. He managed their joint accounts. He decided which paintings should be sold and which clients Clara should turn away. Clara never objected. She had once believed it was his way of caring for her, until she became pregnant. As Clara's belly began to grow, Julian started coming home late more often. Business calls stretched past midnight. His phone was always placed face down on the table. Whenever Clara questioned him, Julian smiled, kissed her forehead, and told her he was working hard to build a better future for their family. His words were as smooth as a fresh coat of varnish spread across a surface that had already begun to rot. One afternoon, when she was nearly 7 months pregnant, Clara entered Julian's office to look for an old picture frame. Behind a dust-covered canvas, she discovered an unfinished portrait. The woman in the painting was young, with dark hair falling over her shoulders and lips curved slightly upward, as though she were looking at the artist with an intimacy that required no concealment. Clara knew immediately that Julian had painted it. He had once told her he never painted portraits because he lacked the patience. On the desk, the tablet they shared suddenly lit up. A message appeared from an account saved under the name Frame Supplier. "The portrait you painted of me is beautiful." "Same place tonight?" Clara felt the child inside her kick hard. She braced one hand against the desk, breathed slowly, and waited for the dizziness to pass. She did not smash the tablet. She did not call Julian and confront him. She did not photograph the portrait and send it to her friends. Clara understood one of the most important principles of restoration. If the solvent was too strong, the original pigment would be destroyed along with the false layer of paint. To uncover the truth, a restorer had to be patient, test every small reaction, and never allow the surface to realize that it was being stripped apart. That evening, Julian returned home carrying a bouquet of white flowers. He looked at Clara sitting at the dining table and asked why she was so quiet. Clara smiled and said she was only tired. Julian believed her. He had always seen Clara as a gentle, private woman who depended on the professional relationships he brought into her life. He did not know that before their marriage, Clara had quietly built a private network of major collectors across Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver. He knew even less about the fact that many of the gallery's most valuable appraisal certificates carried her professional signature. Julian thought he possessed all the power, but Clara was the one capable of determining which works were authentic, which were counterfeit, and which assets could bring his entire empire crashing down. From that day forward, she began recording every trip, every receipt, and every time Julian left the apartment in the middle of the night, the signs of her husband's affair gradually became as visible as cracks exposed beneath ultraviolet light. But when Clara began examining the gallery's inventory records, she discovered that Julian's betrayal was not confined to a single portrait. 3 works from their jointly owned collection had disappeared, and on the transfer documents, Clara's signature had already been placed there before she had ever held the pen. Clara did not touch the transfer documents for the next 3 days. She continued eating breakfast with Julian, asking about his business trips, and listening as he described his wealthy clients in the same familiar, confident voice. Every evening, she still placed a cup of tea beside her husband's laptop. She still asked whether he needed another blanket when the Seattle nights turned cold. She continued allowing Julian to believe that his pregnant wife was far too exhausted to notice that their home had already begun rotting from within. But when Julian slept, Clara worked. She used her phone to photograph every invoice, every ownership certificate, and every email confirming the transportation of a painting. Then she compared them with the private inventory records kept inside her restoration studio. Within a single week, Clara discovered that 7 works had been removed from their shared storage facility. 3 had been listed as undergoing restoration. 2 were recorded as being loaned to clients for display. The remaining 2 had vanished from the system entirely. Every one of them had been transferred to the same address in Oregon, a company called North Cascade Art Holdings. On paper, the company belonged to a man Clara had never heard of, but when she checked the registered address, she recognized it as a commercial mailbox located less than 2 blocks from Elena's former apartment. The truth was no longer a small crack. It was an entire layer of counterfeit paint covering the surface. In her work, Clara had encountered paintings restored so carelessly that the previous restorer had used fresh pigment to conceal the decaying canvas underneath. From a distance, the artwork still looked flawless. Only when placed beneath specialized light did the false layers emerge like bruises. Julian had lived in exactly the same way. The affair was only the outermost layer. Beneath it was a plan that had been prepared for years, a plan designed to take Clara's property, her ownership rights, and her voice. She called Vivian one afternoon while Julian was at the gallery. Vivian was Clara's cousin, a single woman who lived alone in a wooden house outside Portland and worked as a financial advisor for family-owned businesses. The 2 women did not speak often, but Vivian was the only person who had ever warned Clara that Julian cared far too much about placing his name on every asset. Clara said only one sentence. "I think he is transferring my paintings into a shell company." Vivian remained silent for several seconds before telling Clara to send her every document she had. 2 hours later, she called back. "Do not confront him. Do not sign anything else. And from this moment forward, do not leave any original documents inside that apartment." Vivian discovered that North Cascade Art Holdings had been established only 6 months after Clara and Julian's wedding. The company had no employees and conducted no legitimate business, yet it had received multiple works of art from the gallery at prices far below their market value. If Julian sold the paintings through that company, their true value could be hidden during the division of assets in a divorce. Clara placed a hand over her stomach. Leo moved gently beneath her sweater. For the first time, her fear was no longer about her marriage. It was about her son's future. Following Vivian's advice, Clara met Arthur Pendelton, a prominent divorce attorney in Seattle. His office was not large. There were no extravagant glass walls or expensive paintings. There were only crowded filing cabinets and the calm eyes of a man who had witnessed too many marriages collapse. Arthur examined every copy before asking Clara who had appraised the works. "I did," Clara replied. "Who signed the certificates of origin?" "I did." "Who can prove that those paintings belong to the marital estate?" "I can." Arthur looked up at her. "Then you are not the weaker party in this case. Julian has only made you believe that you are." The statement caused Clara to straighten in her chair. The plan to protect her assets during the divorce began that same day. Arthur prepared confidential restrictions against major transactions. Vivian monitored the flow of money, and Clara continued gathering evidence without allowing Julian to become suspicious. The final weeks of her pregnancy became a silent war. Clara's body felt heavy. Her feet were swollen. Some nights, she sat on the bathroom floor, fighting nausea while copying files from Julian's computer. Meanwhile, Julian continued leaving early and returning late. When Clara went into labor, he was supposedly in New York appraising a private collection. At least, that was what he told her. Vivian was the one who held Clara's hand in the hospital. Arthur sent a brief message confirming that the first order blocking Julian's transactions was ready. Leo was born shortly before dawn, pink, tiny, and gripping his mother's finger with all his strength. Julian was not there. 2 days later, Clara received a photograph Vivian had discovered on Elena's private account. In the image, Julian stood beside the swimming pool at a California resort, his hand resting against his lover's lower back. Clara looked down at her son sleeping in her arms. She did not cry. She simply understood that from that moment onward, she was no longer a wife trying to save a marriage. She was a mother preparing to dismantle an entire trap before it could close around her son. And what Julian did not know was that the court's first order would be delivered on the exact day he planned to sell the most valuable painting in their collection. Clara left the apartment at 5:12 in the morning, while Seattle was still buried beneath the rain, and Julian was asleep after a 3-day business trip. She left no letter, no accusations, no warning. Inside the rental car parked in the basement were only 2 suitcases of clothing, 1 bag of Leo's belongings, copies of the financial records, and a hard drive containing every piece of evidence Clara had collected over the past several months. Arthur was already holding the most important original documents. Vivian had copied the appraisal certificates. Clara's personal bank account had also been separated from their shared banking system the week before. Julian had always believed she knew only how to repair old paintings. He did not understand that the finest restorers never dismantled a structure before reinforcing everything that remained. Clara carried Leo down to the car in silence. The baby slept against his mother's chest, breathing softly and evenly. As the elevator doors closed, Clara studied her reflection in the cold metal surface, exhausted, thinner, dark circles beneath her eyes, but no longer afraid. Nearly 4 hours later, Clara reached Vivian's wooden house outside Portland. It stood at the end of a narrow road, surrounded by tall pine trees and a yard still covered in morning mist. Vivian opened the door before Clara had a chance to knock. Neither woman said anything. Vivian simply wrapped Clara in a tight embrace, then lowered her eyes toward Leo. "From this day forward, you and your son are safe." Clara wanted to believe her, but Julian woke shortly before noon. He noticed Leo's empty wardrobe before realizing that Clara's suitcases were gone. During the first few minutes, Julian did not panic. He became furious. He called again and again. 12 missed calls. 23 messages. Then came the threats. "Bring my son back immediately. You are kidnapping my own child. I will make sure you never see him again." Clara read every line but did not respond. Arthur had instructed her to preserve every message and never engage in an argument. A temporary order protecting Clara's custody of Leo had been filed before she left Seattle. Julian did not know that yet. He still believed he was 1 step ahead. 2 days later, Julian appeared outside Vivian's house. The pounding against the door was so violent that Leo began to cry. Clara stood frozen in the living room while Vivian immediately placed her phone on a bookshelf and began recording. Julian shouted Clara's name. He threatened to break down the door. He called her an unstable mother, a paranoid woman, and someone incapable of caring for her own child. Vivian did not open the door. She only spoke through the glass and told him the police were on their way. Julian struck the door one final time before turning away. He had no idea that every word, every blow, and every uncontrolled expression had been captured clearly on camera. 3 weeks later, the first hearing took place in Seattle Family Court. Julian's attorney wore a gray suit and calmly argued that Clara was suffering from postpartum depression, had acted impulsively, and had deliberately separated a father from his son. Julian sat behind him, his face tired but carefully arranged into an expression of calculated grief. He knew how to perform before an audience. He had been doing it for years. Clara sat beside Arthur with both hands resting quietly on the table. She listened as they described her as a weak, dependent woman who had lost control of herself. Each statement felt like another coat of paint being spread across her true image, but Arthur did not object immediately. He allowed Julian's attorney to finish. Then he placed the transaction ledger, the North Cascade Art Holdings records, copies of the forged signatures, and a list of the artworks that had been transferred illegally onto the table. The courtroom fell silent. Arthur presented evidence that Julian had been unfaithful throughout Clara's pregnancy. He displayed the resort booking records from the exact period when Leo was born. Vivian was then called forward to confirm that Julian had appeared outside her home. The video began to play. Julian's voice echoed throughout the courtroom. "I will make sure you never see him again." The color drained from his face, but the final blow had not yet arrived. Clara stood as a licensed appraisal expert. She confirmed the origin, value, and ownership of every artwork Julian had attempted to conceal. Not Arthur. Not Vivian. Clara herself was the only person in the courtroom with the professional authority required to prove the full extent of the asset concealment scheme. Julian turned to look at her. For the first time, he understood that the woman he had underestimated was not merely holding the evidence, she was the evidence. The court granted Clara primary custody, restricted Julian's visits, and ordered every asset connected to the gallery to be frozen. Each transferred artwork had to be recovered and appraised again. When the judge concluded the hearing, Julian remained completely still. The empire he had built from appearances, carefully chosen words, and forged signatures began collapsing before his eyes. Clara walked out of the courthouse with Leo in her arms. Outside, the Seattle rain had stopped, but her new life had only just begun. 6 months after the hearing, Clara hung a small sign bearing the name Vance Restoration Studio on the wooden door of an old apartment in Portland. There was no enormous exhibition hall. No crystal chandelier or cold white walls like the ones inside Julian's gallery. Her new studio consisted of only 2 rooms, one large east-facing window, and a restoration table Clara had purchased from a retired artist. But everything inside belonged to her. Each morning, Clara placed Leo in a small crib beside the window. Sunlight passed through the thin curtains and settled across his round cheeks. While Leo slept, she put on her protective glasses, prepared her solvents, and bent over surfaces that time had cracked and damaged. She was no longer working to keep Julian's gallery shining. She was working under her own name. Clara's first client was an elderly woman who brought in a family portrait damaged during a flood. The paint had separated from the canvas, one corner of the frame had rotted. The face of the husband in the portrait had almost completely disappeared. The woman asked whether it could still be saved. Clara studied the painting for a long time before answering that not every part could be returned to its original condition. But if the underlying canvas remained strong enough, the hidden areas could be cleaned, the weakest sections could be reinforced, and everything truly worth remembering could be preserved. She did not know whether she was speaking about the painting or her own life. The first months in Portland were not easy. Clara woke several times each night when Leo cried. During the day, she cared for him while answering clients, transporting paintings, and completing every piece of business paperwork herself. Some weeks, the studio rent consumed nearly all her income. Some evenings, Clara sat beside the window, watching unfamiliar houses light up in the distance, wondering whether she was truly strong enough to begin again. But the following morning, Leo always woke with both tiny hands reaching toward his mother, and Clara stood up again. Vivian visited every weekend. She helped Clara create financial plans, find clients, and care for Leo on the days Clara had to meet with collectors. Arthur occasionally sent updates regarding the recovery of Julian's assets. His gallery had closed. North Cascade Art Holdings was being investigated for fraudulent transactions. Many clients who had once praised Julian began withdrawing when they discovered that the most valuable certificates had all been completed by Clara. Julian lost the reputation he had spent years building. But Clara did not celebrate. She understood that Julian's collapse could not become the foundation of her new life. If she continued looking toward him, she would still be allowing him to occupy part of her mind. So she stopped asking Arthur what Julian had lost. She focused on what she was building. 1 year after leaving Seattle, Clara was invited to restore a valuable private collection in Oregon. The owner had worked with Julian in the past, but he made it clear that he had not approached her because of the Vance name. He had approached her because of Clara's professional signature. For the first time, Clara understood that real power did not exist inside luxurious galleries, expensive suits, or the ability to make others believe a perfectly staged story. Power existed in the knowledge, integrity, and skill that no one could take away from her after years of careful work. On the evening she signed the contract, Clara returned to the studio while Leo slept against Vivian's shoulder. She placed the agreement inside a drawer, then looked at the painting lying on her table. It was an old landscape covered beneath a layer of dark varnish. After many days of cleaning, a stretch of blue sky had slowly emerged behind the gray clouds. Clara touched the final crack with the tip of her finest brush. She did not erase it completely. In restoration, trying to conceal every trace of damage could sometimes turn an artwork into something false. A properly treated crack did not make a painting less valuable. It proved that the work had survived. Clara had survived as well. She did not forget the betrayal. She did not deny the nights when she had been afraid. She did not pretend that leaving a toxic marriage had been an easy journey. Healing after heartbreak did not mean returning to the person she had been before. It meant becoming someone new, stronger, more aware, and no longer willing to give anyone else the power to determine her worth. Clara walked toward the window. The lights of Portland were beginning to glow. Behind her, Leo stirred before falling asleep again, one small hand holding the collar of his mother's shirt. The old painting of Clara's life had reached its end. But on this new canvas, she was no longer a supporting character in another man's story. She was the one holding the brush, and this time, her life would be painted according to her own choices. Sometimes the end of one life is only the beginning of another. Clara did not rebuild herself by forgetting the betrayal. She rebuilt herself by reclaiming her voice, protecting her son, and choosing a future no one else could control. What would you have done in her place? Would you have confronted Julian immediately, or waited until every piece of evidence was secure? Share your thoughts in the comments. If Clara's story reminded you that strength can grow from even the deepest betrayal, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of family conflict, courage, justice, and new beginnings.